The room began to seem absurdly cramped. His sheer bulk was intimidating. But there was something more. Something that seemed to come off him in sickly waves. The soldiers around the walls felt it, and they shifted uncomfortably. The Under-Secretary for Audiences felt it, sweating and twitching and fussing with his documents. Major West certainly felt it. His skin had gone cold despite the heat, and he could feel every hair on his body standing up under his damp uniform. Only Hoff seemed unaffected. He looked the four Northmen up and down with a deep frown on his face, no more impressed with the hooded giant than he had been with Goodman Heath. "So you are messengers from Bethod?" He rolled the words around his mouth, then spat them out. "The King of the Northmen." "We are," said the smiling old man, bowing with great reverence. "I am White-Eye Hansel." His voice was rich, round, and pleasant, without any accent, not at all what West had been expecting. "And you are Bethod's emissary?" asked Hoff casually, taking another swallow of wine from his goblet. For the first time ever, West was pleased the Lord Chamberlain was in the room with him. But then he glanced up at the hooded man, and the feeling of unease returned. "Oh no," said White-Eye. "I am here merely as translator. This is the emissary of the King of the Northmen," and his good eye flicked nervously up to the dark figure in the cloak, as though even he was afraid. "Fenris." He stretched out the S on the end of the name so that it hissed in the air. "Fenris the Feared." An apt name indeed. Major West thought back to songs he had heard in his childhood, stories of bloodthirsty giants in the mountains of the distant north. The room was silent for a moment. said the Lord Chamberlain, unmoved. "And you seek an audience with His August Majesty, the High King of the Union?" "We do indeed, my Lord Chamberlain," said the old warrior. "Our master, Bethod, greatly regrets the hostility between our two nations. He wishes only to be on the best of terms with his southern neighbors. We bring an offer of peace from my king to yours, and a gift to show our good faith. Nothing more." "Well, well," said Hoff, sitting back in his high chair with a broad smile. "A gracious request, graciously made. You may see the king in open council tomorrow and present your offer and your gift before the foremost peers of the realm." White-Eye bowed respectfully. "You are most kind, my Lord Chamberlain." He turned for the door, followed by the two Dur warriors. The cloaked figure lingered for a moment, then he too slowly turned and stooped through the doorway. It wasn't until the doors were shut that West could breathe easily again. He shook his head and shrugged his sweaty shoulders. Songs about giants, indeed. A great big man in a cloak was all. But looking again, that doorway really was very high. "There! You see, Master Moreau?" Hoff looked intensely pleased with himself. "Hardly the savages you led me to expect. I feel we are close to a resolution of our northern problems, don't you?" The Under-Secretary did not look in the least convinced.
Yes, my lord, of course."
"Yes, indeed. A lot of fuss over nothing. A lot of pessimistic, defeatist nonsense from our jumpy citizens up north, eh? War? Bah!" Hoff whacked his hand on the table again, making wine slop out of his goblet and spatter on the wood. "These Northmen wouldn't dare. Why, next thing you know, they'll be petitioning us for membership of the Union. You see if I'm not right, eh, Major West?" Good. Excellent. We've got something done today, at least. One more, and we can get out of this damn furnace. Who do we have, Morrow?" The Under-Secretary frowned and pushed his glasses up his nose.
We have one Yoru Sulfur.
He wrestled with the unfamiliar name. We have a who?
Sulfia, or sulfur, or something.
Never heard of him, grunted the Lord Chamberlain. What manner of a man is he? Some kind of a southerner? Not another peasant, please. The Under-Secretary examined his notes and swallowed.
An emissary?
Yes, but from whom? Morrow was positively cringing, like a child expecting a slap.
From the Great Order of Magi,
he blurted out. There was a moment of stunned silence. West's eyebrows went up and his jaw came open, and he guessed that the same was happening unseen behind the visors of the soldiers. He winced instinctively as he anticipated the response of the Lord Chamberlain, but Hoff surprised them all by bursting into peals of laughter. Excellent! At last, some entertainment! It's been years since we had a Magus here. Show in the wizard. We mustn't keep him waiting. Yoru Sulfur was something of a disappointment. He had simple, travel-stained clothes, was scarcely better dressed than Goodman Heath had been, in fact. His staff was not shod with gold, had no lump of shining crystal on the end. His eye did not flash with a mysterious fire. He looked a fairly ordinary sort of a man in his middle 30s, slightly tired, as though after a long journey, but otherwise well at his ease before the Lord Chamberlain. A good day to you, gentlemen, he said, leaning on his staff. West was having some difficulty working out where he was from. Not the Union, because his skin was too dark, and not Gurkle, or the far south, because his skin was too light. Not from the north, or from Styria. Further, then, but where? Now that West looked at him more closely, he noticed that his eyes were different colors, one blue, one green. "And a good day to you, sir," said Hoff, smiling as though he really meant it. "My door is forever open to the Great Order of Magi. Tell me, do I have the pleasure of addressing Great Bias himself?" Sulfur looked puzzled.
No. Was I wrongly announced? I am Yoru Sulfur. Master Bias is a bold gentleman.
He pushed a hand through his own head of curly brown hair.
There is a statue of him outside in the avenue. But I did have the honor to study under him for several years. He is a most powerful and knowledgeable master.
Of course he is. And how may we be of service? Yoru Sulfur cleared his throat, as though to tell a story.
On the death of King Harald the Great, Bias, the first of the Magi, left the Union, but he swore an oath to return.
Yes, that's true, chuckled Hoff. Very true. Every schoolchild knows it.
And he pronounced that, when he returned, his coming would be heralded by another.
True also.
Well,
said Sulfur, smiling broadly,
here I am.
The Lord Chamberlain roared with laughter.
You are!
He shouted, thumping the table. Harlan Morrow allowed himself a little chuckle, but shut up immediately as Hoff's smile began to fade. During my tenure as Lord Chamberlain, I have had 3 members of the Great Order of Magi apply to me for audiences with the king. 2 were most clearly insane, and 1 was an exceptionally courageous swindler. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers before him. Tell me, Master Sulfur, which kind of Magus are you?
I am neither of those.
I see. Then you will have documents?
Of course.
Sulfur reached into his coat and brought out a small letter, closed with a white seal, a single strange symbol stamped into it. He placed it carelessly on the table before the Lord Chamberlain. Hoff frowned. He picked up the document and turned it over in his hands. He examined the seal carefully. Then he dabbed his face with his sleeve, broke the wax, unfolded the thick paper, and began to read. Yoru Sulfur showed no sign of nerves. He didn't appear troubled by the heat. He strolled around the room. He nodded to the armoured soldiers. He didn't seem upset by their lack of response. He turned suddenly to West.
It's terribly hot in here, isn't it? It's a wonder these poor fellows don't pass out and crash to the floor with a sound like a cupboard full of saucepans.
West blinked. He had been thinking the very same thing. The Lord Chamberlain put the letter down carefully on the table, no longer in the least amused.
It occurs to me that the open council would be the wrong place to discuss this matter. I agree. I was hoping for a private audience with Lord Chancellor Heath. I am afraid that will not be possible.
Hoff licked his lips.
Lord Heath is dead.
Sulphur frowned.
That is most unfortunate. Indeed, we all feel his loss most keenly. Perhaps I and certain other members of the closed council can assist you.
Sulphur bowed his head.
I am guided by you, my Lord Chamberlain. I will try to arrange something for later this evening. Until then, we will find you some lodgings within the Agriont, suitable for your station.
He signalled to the guards, and the doors were opened.
Thank you so much, Lord Hoff. Master Morrow, Major West.
Sulphur nodded to them graciously, each in turn, and then turned and left. The doors were closed once more, leaving West wondering how the man had known his name. Hoff turned to his Under-Secretary for Audiences.
Go immediately to Archlector Salt and tell him we must meet at once. Then fetch High Justice Morovia and Lord Marshal Varuz. Tell them it is a matter of the very highest importance, and not a word of this to anyone beyond those three.
He shook his finger in Morrow's sweaty face.
Not a word.
The Under-Secretary stared back, spectacles askew.
Now!
Roared Hoff. Morrow leapt to his feet, stumbled on the hem of his gown, then hurried out through a side door. West swallowed, his mouth very dry. Hoff stared long and hard at each man in the room.
As for the rest of you, not a word to anyone about any of this, or the consequences for all of you will be most severe. Now out! Everyone out!
The soldiers clanked from the room immediately. West needed no further encouragement, and he hurried after them, leaving the brooding Lord Chamberlain alone in his high chair. West's thoughts were dark and confused as he pulled the door shut behind him. Fragments of old stories of the Magi, fears about war in the north, images of a hooded giant towering up near the ceiling. There had been some strange and some sinister visitors to the Agriont that day, and he felt quite weighed down by worries. He tried to shrug them off, told himself it was all foolishness, but then all he could think of was his sister, cavorting about the Agriont like a fool. He groaned to himself. She was probably with Luthar right now. Why the hell had he introduced the two of them? For some reason, he had been expecting the same awkward, sickly, sharp-tongued girl he remembered from years ago. He had got quite a shock when this woman had turned up at his quarters. He had barely recognized her. Undoubtedly a woman, and a fine-looking one, too. Meanwhile, Luthar was arrogant and rich and handsome and had all the self-restraint of a 6-year-old. He knew they had seen each other since, and more than once. Just as friends, of course. Adi had no other friends here. Just friends. Shit, he cursed. It was like putting a cat by the cream and trusting it not to stick its tongue in. Why the hell hadn't he thought it through? It was a damn disaster in the making. But what could he do about it now? He stared off miserably down the hallway. There's nothing like seeing another's misery to make you forget your own, and Goodman Heath was a sorry sight indeed. He was sitting alone on a long bench, face deathly pale, staring off into space. He must have been sitting there all this time, while the Mercers and the Northmen and the Magus came and went, waiting for nothing, but with nowhere left to go. West glanced up and down the hallway. There was no one else nearby. Heath was oblivious to him, mouth open, eyes glassy, battered hat forgotten on his knees. West couldn't simply leave the man like this. He didn't have it in him. "Goodman Heath," he said as he approached, and the peasant looked up at him, surprised. He fumbled for his hat and made to rise, muttering apologies. "No, please, don't get up." West sat down on the bench. He stared at his feet, unable to look the man in the eye. There was an awkward silence. "I have a friend who sits on the Commission for Land and Agriculture. There might be something he can do for you." He trailed off, embarrassed, squinting up the corridor. The farmer gave a sad smile. "I'd be right grateful for anything you could do." Yes, of course. I'll do what I can." It would do no good whatsoever, and they both knew it. West grimaced and bit his lip. "You'd better take this." And he pressed his purse into the peasant's limp, calloused fingers. Heath looked at him, mouth slightly open. West gave a quick, awkward smile, then got to his feet. He was very keen to be off. "Sir!" called Goodman Heath after him, but West was already hurrying down the corridor, and he didn't look back. Chapter 11. On the List. Why do I do this? The outline of Willem Dan Rob's townhouse was cut out in black against the clear night sky. It was an unremarkable building, a 2-story dwelling with a low wall and a gate in front, just like 100 others in this street. Our old friend Ruse used to live in a palatial great villa near the market. Rob really should have asked him for some more ambitious bribes. Still, lucky for us, he didn't. Elsewhere in the city, the fashionable avenues would be brightly lit and busy with drunken revelers right through until dawn. But this secluded side street was far from the bright lights and the prying eyes. We can work undisturbed. Round the side of the building, on the upper floor, a lamp was burning in a narrow window. Good. Our friend is at home, but still awake. We must tread gently. He turned to Practical Frost and pointed down the side of the house. The albino nodded and slipped away silently across the street. Glocter waited for him to reach the wall and disappear into the shadows beside the building. Then he turned to Severard and pointed at the front door. The eyes of the lanky Practical smiled at him for a moment, then he scuttled quickly away, staying low, rolled over the low wall, and dropped without a sound onto the other side. Perfect so far, but now I must move. Glocter wondered why he had come. Frost and Severard were more than capable of dealing with Rob by themselves, and he would only slow them down. I might even fall on my arse and alert the idiot to our presence, so why did I come? But Glocter knew why. The feeling of excitement was already building in his throat. It felt almost like being alive. He had muffled the end of his cane with a bit of rag, so he was able to limp to the wall ever so delicately without making too much noise. By that time, Severard had swung the gate open, holding the hinge with one gloved hand so that it didn't make a noise. Nice and neat. That little wall might as well be 100 feet high for all my chances of getting over it. Severard was kneeling on the step against the front door, picking the lock. His ear was close to the wood, his eyes squinting with concentration, gloved hands moving deftly. Glocter's heart was beating fast, his skin prickly with tension. Ah, the thrill of the hunt. There was a soft click, then another. Severard slipped his glittering picks into a pocket, then reached out and slowly, carefully turned the doorknob. The door swung silently open. What a useful fellow he is. Without him and Frost, I am just a cripple. They are my hands, my arms, my legs. But I am their brains. Severard slipped inside, and Glocter followed him, wincing with pain every time he put his weight on his left leg. The hallway was dark, but there was a shaft of light spilling down the stairs from above, and the banisters cast strange, distorted shadows on the wooden floor. Glocta pointed up the steps, and Severard nodded and began to tiptoe toward them, keeping his feet close to the wall. It seemed to take him an age to get there. The third step made a quiet creaking sound as he put his weight on it. Glocta winced. Severard froze in place. They waited, still as statues. There was no sound from upstairs. Glocta began to breathe again. Severard moved ever so slowly upwards, step by gentle step. As he got towards the top, he peered cautiously round the corner, back pressed against the wall. Then he took the last step and disappeared from view without a sound. Practical Frost emerged from the shadows at the far end of the corridor. Glocta raised an eyebrow at him, but he shook his head. Nobody downstairs. He turned to the front door and started to close it ever so gently. Only when it was shut did he slowly release the doorknob so the latch slid silently into place. "You'll want to see this." Glocta gave a start at the sudden sound, turning round quickly and causing a jolt of pain to shoot through his back. Severard was standing, hands on hips, at the head of the stairs. He turned and made off towards the light, and Frost bounded up the steps after him, no longer making any pretense at stealth. Why can no one ever stay on the ground floor? Always upstairs. At least he didn't have to try to be quiet as he struggled up the steps after his practicals, right foot creaking, left foot scraping on the boards. Bright lamplight was flooding out into the upstairs corridor from an open door at the far end, and Glocta limped toward it. He paused as he crossed the threshold, catching his breath after the climb. Oh, dear me, what a mess. A big bookcase had been torn away from the wall, and books were scattered, open and closed, all about the floor. A glass of wine had been knocked over on the desk, making sodden red rags of the crumpled papers strewn across it. The bed was in disarray, the covers pulled half off, the pillows and the mattress slashed and spilling feathers. A wardrobe had its doors open, one of them dangling half off. A few tattered garments were hanging inside, but most were lying torn in a heap below. A handsome young man lay on his back under the window, staring up, pale-faced and open-mouthed at the ceiling. It would have been an understatement to say that his throat had been cut. It had been hacked so savagely that his head was only just still attached. There was blood splattered everywhere, on the torn clothes, on the slashed mattress, all over the body itself. There were a couple of smeared, bloody palm prints on the wall, a great pool of blood across a good part of the floor, still wet. He was killed tonight, perhaps only a few hours ago, perhaps only a few minutes. "I don't think he'll be answering our questions," said Severard. "No." Glocta's eyes drifted over the wreckage. "I think he might be dead. But how did it happen?" Frost fixed him with a pink eye and raised a white eyebrow.
"Poison?"
Severard spluttered with shrill laughter under his mask. Even Glocta allowed himself a chuckle. "Clearly. But how did our poison get in?"
"Open window,"
mumbled Frost, pointing at the floor. Glocta limped into the room, careful not to let his feet or his cane touch the sticky mess of blood and feathers. So, our poison saw the lamp burning just as we did. He entered via the downstairs window. He climbed silently up the stairs. Glocta turned the corpse's hands over with the tip of his cane. A few specks of blood from the neck, but no damage to the knuckles or the fingers. He did not struggle. He was taken by surprise. He craned forward and peered at the gaping wound. A single powerful cut, probably with a knife. "And Willem den robbers sprung a most serious leak," said Severard. "And we are short one informant," mused Glocta. There had been no blood in the corridor. Our man took pains not to get his feet wet while searching the room, however messy it may look. He was not angry or afraid. It was just a job. "The killer was a professional," murmured Glocta. "He came here with murder in mind. Then perhaps he made this little effort to give the appearance of a burglary. Who can say? Either way, the Archlector won't be satisfied with a corpse." He looked up at his two practicals. "Who's next on the list?" This time there had been a struggle without a doubt, if a one-sided one. Solimo Scandi was sprawled on his side, facing the wall, as though embarrassed by the state of his slashed and tattered nightshirt. There were deep cuts in his forearms, where he struggled vainly to ward off the blade. He had crawled across the floor, leaving a bloody trail across the highly polished wood, where he struggled vainly to get away. He had failed. The 4 gaping knife wounds in his back had been the end of him. Glocta felt his face twitching as he looked down at the bloody corpse. One body might just be a coincidence. 2 make a conspiracy. His eyelid fluttered. Whoever did this knew we were coming, and when, and precisely who for. They are one step ahead of us. More than likely, our list of accomplices has already become a list of corpses. There was a creaking sound behind Glocta, and his head whipped round, sending shooting pains down his stiff neck. Nothing but the open window swinging in the breeze. Calm now. Calm and think it out. It would seem the Honourable Guild of Mercers have been doing a little housekeeping. How could they know? Muttered Severard. How indeed. They must have seen Ruth's list, or been told who was on it. And that means... Glocta licked at his empty gums. Someone inside the Inquisition has been talking. For once, Severard's eyes were not smiling. If they know who's on the list, they know who wrote it. They know who we are. 3 more names on the list, perhaps, down at the bottom. Glocta grinned. How very exciting. You scared? I'm not happy, I'll tell you that. He nodded down at the corpse. A knife in the back isn't part of my plan. Nor mine, Severard. Believe me. No, indeed. If I die, I'll never know who betrayed us. And I want to know. A bright, cloudless spring day, and the park was busy with fops and idlers of every variety. Glocta sat very still on his bench, in the merciful shade of a spreading tree, and stared out at the shimmering greenery, the sparkling water, the happy, the drunken, the colourful revellers. There were people wedged together on the benches around the lake, pairs and groups scattered around the grass, drinking and talking and basking in the sun. There seemed no space for any more. But no one came and sat next to Glocta. Occasionally somebody would hurry up, hardly able to believe their luck in finding such a spot. Then they would see him sitting there. Their faces would fall, and they would swerve away or walk right past as though they had never meant to sit. I'd drive them away as surely as the plague, but perhaps that's just as well. I don't need their company. He watched a group of young soldiers rowing a boat on the lake. One of them stood up, wobbling around, holding forth with a bottle in his hand. The boat rocked alarmingly, and his companions shouted at him to get down. Vague gales of good-natured laughter came wafting through the air, delayed a little by the distance. Children, how young they look, how innocent. And such was I, not long ago. It seems 1,000 years, though. Longer. It seems a different world. Glocta! He looked up, shading his eyes with his hand. It was Archlector Salt, arrived at last, a tall, dark shape against the blue sky. Glocta thought he looked a little more tired, more lined, more drawn than usual as he stared coldly down. This had better be interesting. Salt flicked out the tails of his long white coat and lowered himself gracefully onto the bench.
The commoners are up in arms again near Keln. Some idiot of a landowner hangs a few peasants, and now we have a mess to deal with. How hard can it be to manage a field full of dirt and a couple of farmers? You don't have to treat them well, just as long as you don't hang them.
His mouth was a straight, hard line as he glared out across the lawns.
This had better be damned interesting.
Then I'll try not to disappoint you. Willem Dan Rob is dead. As though to add emphasis to Glockter's statement, the drunken soldier slipped and toppled over the side of the boat, splashing into the water. His friend's screams of laughter reached Glockter a moment later. He was murdered.
Ha! It happens. Pick up the next man on the list.
Salt got to his feet, frowning.
I didn't think you'd need my approval for every little thing. That's why I picked you for this job. Just get on with it,
he snapped as he turned away. There's no need to rush, Archlector. That's the trouble with good legs. You tend to run around too much. If you have trouble moving, on the other hand, you don't move until you damn well know it's time. The next man on the list also suffered a mishap. Salt turned back, one eyebrow slightly raised.
He did?
They all did. The Archlector pursed his lips, sat back down on the bench.
All of them?
All of them. Mused Salt.
That is interesting. The mercers are cleaning up, are they? I hardly expected such ruthlessness. Times have changed, all right.
Times have certainly. He trailed off, slowly starting to frown.
You think someone gave them Rue's list, don't you? You think one of ours has been talking? That's why you asked me to come here, isn't it?
Did you think I was just avoiding the stairs? Each one of them killed, each and every name on our list, the very night we go to arrest them? I am not a great believer in coincidences. Are you, Archlector? He was evidently not. His face had turned very grim.
Who saw the confession?
Me and my two practicals, of course.
You have absolute confidence in them?
Absolute. There was a pause. The boat was drifting, rudderless, as the soldiers scrambled about, oars sticking up in the air, the man in the water splashing and laughing, spraying water over his friends.
The confession was in my office for some time, murmured the Archlector. Some members of my staff could have seen it. Could have.
You have absolute confidence in them, Your Eminence? Salt stared at Glockter for a long, icy moment.
They wouldn't dare. They know me better than that.
That leaves Superior Kaline, said Glockter quietly. The Archlector's lips hardly moved as he spoke.
You must tread carefully, Inquisitor, very carefully. The ground is not at all safe where you are walking. Fools do not become superiors of the Inquisition, despite appearances. Kaline has many friends, both within the House of Questions and outside it. Powerful friends. Any accusation against him must be backed up by the very strongest of proof.
Salt stopped suddenly, waiting for a small group of ladies to pass out of earshot. The very strongest of proof, he hissed, once they had moved away.
You must find me this assassin.
Easier said than done. Of course, Your Eminence, but my investigation hath reached something of a dead end.
Not quite. We still have one card left to play. Ruse himself.
Ruse? But, Archlector, he will be in England by now, sweating down a mine or some such, if he has even lasted this long.
No, he is here in the Agriont under lock and key. I thought it best to hold on to him.
Glockter did his utmost to contain his surprise. Clever, very clever. Fools do not become Archlectors either, it seems.
Ruse will be your bait. I will have my secretary carry a message to Kaline letting him know that I have relented, that I am prepared to let the mercers continue to operate, but under tighter control, that as a gesture of goodwill, I have let Ruse go. If Kaline is the source of our leak, I dare say he will let the mercers know that Ruse is free. I dare say they will send this assassin to punish him for his loose tongue. I dare say you could take him while he is trying. If the killer doesn't come, well, we might have to look for our traitor elsewhere, and we have lost nothing.
An excellent plan, Your Eminence. Salt stared at him coldly.
Of course, you will need somewhere to operate, somewhere far from the House of Questions. I will make the funds available, have Ruse delivered to your practicals, and let you know when Kaline has the information.
Find me this assassin, Glocta, and squeeze him. Squeeze him until the pips squeak. The boat lurched wildly as the soldiers tried to haul their wet companion in. Then it suddenly turned right over, dumping them all into the water.
I want names, hissed Salt, glowering at the splashing soldiers. I want names and evidence and documents and people who will stand up in open council and point fingers.
He stood up smoothly from the bench.
Keep me informed.
He strode off towards the House of Questions, feet crunching on the gravel of the path, and Glocta watched him go. An excellent plan. I'm glad you're on my side, Archlector. You are on my side, aren't you? The soldiers had succeeded in hauling the upended boat onto the bank and were standing, dripping wet, shouting at one another, no longer so good-humoured. One of the oars was still floating, abandoned in the water, drifting gradually towards the point where the stream flowed from the lake. Soon it would pass under the bridge and be carried out beneath the great walls of the Agriont and into the moat. Glocta watched it turning slowly round in the water. A mistake. One should attend to the details. It is easy to forget the little things, but without the oar, the boat is useless. He let his gaze wander across some of the other faces in the park. His eye alighted on a handsome pair sitting on a bench by the lake. The young man was speaking quietly to the girl, a sad and earnest expression on his face. She got up quickly, moving away from him with her hands over her face. Ah, the pain of the jilted lover, the loss, the anger, the shame. It seems as though you'll never recover. What poet was it who wrote, "There's no pain worse than the pain of a broken heart"? Sentimental shit. He should have spent more time in the Emperor's prisons. He smiled, opening his mouth and licking the empty gums where his front teeth used to be. Broken hearts heal with time, but broken teeth never do. Glocta looked at the young man. He had an expression of slight amusement on his face as he watched the weeping girl walk away. The young bastard. I wonder if he's broken as many hearts as I did in my youth. It hardly seems possible now. It takes me half an hour just to pluck up the courage to stand. The only women I've made cry lately have been the wives of those I've had exiled to Angland. Send! Glocta turned around. Lord Marshal Varuth, what an honor. Oh, no, said the old soldier, sitting down on the bench with the swift, precise movements of the fencing master. You look well, he said, but without really looking. I look crippled, you mean? How are you, my old friend? I'm crippled, you pompous old ass. And friend, is it? All those years since I came back, and you have never sought me out, not once. Is that a friendship? Well enough, thank you, Lord Marshal. Varuz shifted uncomfortably on the bench. My latest student, Captain Lothar, perhaps you know him? We are acquainted. You should see his forms. Varuz shook his head sadly. He has the talent, all right, though he will never be in your class, Sand. I don't know. I hope someday he'll be just as crippled as I am. But he has plenty of talent, enough to win. Only he's wasting it, throwing it away. Oh, the tragedy of it. I am so upset I could be sick. Had I eaten anything this morning? He is lazy, Sand, and stubborn. He lacks courage. He lacks dedication. His heart is just not in it, and time is running out. I was wondering, if you have the time, of course. Burroughs looked Glocta in the eye for just an instant. Whether you might be able to speak to him for me. I can hardly wait. Lecturing that whining ass would be the realization of all my dreams. Arrogant old dolt, how dare you? You built your reputation on my successes, then when I needed your help you cut me off. And now you come to me and seek my help and call me friend? Of course, Marshal Varus. I would be glad to speak to him. Anything for an old friend. Excellent, excellent. I'm sure you'll make all the difference. I train him every morning in that courtyard near the house of the Maker, where I used to train you. The old marshal trailed off awkwardly. I will come as soon as my duties permit. Of course, your duties. Varus was already getting up, evidently keen to be on his way. Glocta held out his hand, making the old soldier pause for a moment. You needn't worry, Lord Marshal. I am not contagious. Varus gave it a limp shake, as though worried it might snap off. Then he mumbled his excuses and strode away, head held high. The dripping soldiers bowed and saluted as he walked past, somewhat embarrassed. Glocta stretched out his leg, wondering whether to get up. And go where? The world will not end if I sit here a moment longer. There is no rush. No rush. Chapter 12. An Offer and a Gift. And forward! Bellowed Marshal Varus. Jezal lurched at him, toes curling round the edges of the beam, trying desperately to keep his balance, making a clumsy lunge or two just to give the impression of his heart being in it. 4 hours of training a day were taking their toll on him, and he felt beyond mere exhaustion. Varus frowned and flicked Jezal's blunted steel aside, moving effortlessly along the beam as though it was a garden path. And back! Jezal stumbled back on his heels, left arm waving stupidly around him in an attempt to keep his balance. Everything above his knees was aching terribly from the effort. Below the knees it was much, much worse. Varus was over 60, but he showed no signs of fatigue. He wasn't even sweating as he danced forward down the beam, swishing his steels around. Jezal himself was gasping for air as he parried desperately with his left hand, badly off balance, his right foot fishing in space for the safety of the beam behind him. And forward! Jezal's calves were agony as he stumbled to change his direction and shove a blow at the infuriating old man, but Varus did not move back. Instead, he ducked under the despairing cut and used the back of his arm to sweep Jezal's feet away. Jezal let out a howl as the courtyard turned over around him. His legs smacked painfully against the edge of the beam, then he sprawled on his face on the grass, chin thumping into the turf and making his teeth rattle. He rolled a short distance, then lay there on his back, gasping like a fish snatched suddenly from the water, leg throbbing where it had collided with the beam on his way down. He would have yet another ugly bruise in the morning. "Awful, Jezal, awful!" cried the old soldier as he sprang nimbly down onto the lawn. "You teeter about the beam as though it were a tightrope." Jezal rolled over, cursing, and started to climb stiffly to his feet. "It is a solid piece of oak, wide enough to get lost in." The Lord Marshal illustrated his point by whacking at the beam with his short steel, making splinters fly. "I thought you said forward," moaned Jezal. Varus's eyebrows went up sharply. "Do you seriously suppose, Captain Luthar, that Bremer Dangorst gives his opponents reliable information as to his intentions?" "Bremer Dangorst will be trying to beat me, you old shit. You are supposed to be helping me to beat him." That was what Giselle thought, but he knew better than to say it. He just shook his head dumbly. No, indeed he does not. He makes every effort to deceive and confuse his opponents, as all great swordsmen must. The Lord Marshal paced up and down, shaking his head. Giselle considered again whether to give it all up. He was sick of falling into bed exhausted each night, at a time when he should have been just starting to get drunk. He was sick of waking up every morning, bruised and aching, to face another 4 interminable hours of running, beam, bar, forms. He was sick of being knocked on his arse by Major West. Most of all, he was sick of being bullied by this old fool. A depressing display, Captain, very depressing. I do believe you are actually getting worse. Giselle would never win the contest. No one expected him to, himself least of all. So why not give it up and go back to his cards and late nights? Wasn't that all he really wanted from life? But then what would mark him out from 1,000 other noble younger sons? He had decided long ago that he wanted to be something special. A Lord Marshal himself, perhaps, and then Lord Chamberlain. Something big and important, anyway. He wanted a big chair on the closed council, and to make big decisions. He wanted people to fawn and smile around him and hang on his every word. He wanted people to whisper, "There goes Lord Luther," as he swept past. Could he be happy being forever a richer, cleverer, better-looking version of Lieutenant Brint? Ugh! It was not to be thought of. We have a terribly long way to go, and not enough time to get there, not unless you change your attitude. Your sparring is lamentable. Your stamina is still weak, and as for your balance, the less said about that, the better. And what would everyone else think if he gave up? What would his father do? What would his brothers say? What about the other officers? He would look a coward. And then there was R.D. West. She seemed to have been much on his mind during the past couple of days. Would she lean so close to him if he didn't fence? Would she talk to him in such soft tones? Would she laugh at his jokes? Would she look up at him with those big dark eyes so he could almost feel her breath on his face? "Are you listening, boy?" thundered Varuz. Giselle felt a bit of his breath on his face, all right, and a deal of spit, too. "Yes, sir. Sparring lamentable, stamina weak." Giselle swallowed nervously. "Less said about balance, the better." "That's right. I am beginning to think, though I can hardly believe it after the trouble you have put me to, that your heart really isn't in this." He glared into Giselle's eyes. "What do you think, Major?" There was no reply. West was slumped in his chair, arms folded, frowning grimly and staring into space. "Major West!" snapped the Lord Marshal. He looked up suddenly, as though he'd only just become aware of their presence. "I'm sorry, sir. I had become distracted." "So I see." Varuz sucked his teeth. "It seems that nobody has been concentrating this morning." It was a great relief that some of the old man's anger had been deflected elsewhere, but Giselle's happiness was not long-lived. "Very well," snapped the old marshal. "If that's the way you want it, starting tomorrow, we will begin each session with a swim in the moat. A mile or 2 should do it." Giselle squeezed his teeth together to keep from screaming. "Cold water has a wonderful way of sharpening the senses, and perhaps we need to start a little earlier to catch you in your most receptive frame of mind. That means we begin at 5. In the meantime, Captain Luthar, I suggest that you consider whether you are here in order to win the contest or simply for the pleasure of my company." And he turned on his heel and stalked off. Giselle waited until Varuz had left the courtyard before losing his temper, but once he was sure the old man was out of earshot, he flung his steels against the wall in a fury. "Damn it!" he shouted as the swords rattled to the ground. "Shit!" He looked around for something to kick that wouldn't hurt too much. His eye lighted on the leg of the beam. but he misjudged the kick badly and had to stifle the urge to grab his bruised foot and hop around like an idiot. "Shit! Shit!" he raged. West was disappointingly unimpressed. He got up, frowning, and made to follow Marshal Varus. "Where are you off to?" asked Giselle. "Away," said West over his shoulder. "I've seen enough." "What does that mean?" West stopped and turned to face him. "Amazing though it may seem, there are bigger problems in the world than this." Giselle stood there open-mouthed as West stalked from the courtyard. "Just who do you think you are?" he shouted after him once he was sure he was gone. "Shit! Shit!" He considered giving the beam another kick, but thought better of it. Giselle was in a foul mood on his way back to his quarters, so he stayed away from the busier parts of the Agriant, sticking to the quieter lanes and gardens to the side of the Kingsway. He glowered down at his feet as he walked to further discourage any social encounter, but luck was not on his side. "Giselle!" It was Caspar, out for a stroll with a yellow-haired girl in expensive clothes. They had a severe-looking middle-aged woman with them, no doubt the girl's governess or some such. They had stopped to admire some piece of minor sculpture in a little visited yard. "Giselle!" Caspar shouted again, waving his hat above his head. There was no avoiding them. He plastered an unconvincing smile onto his face and stalked over. The pale girl smiled at him as he approached, but if he was meant to be charmed, he didn't feel it. "Been fencing again, Luther?" asked Caspar pointlessly. Giselle was sweating and holding a pair of fencing steels. It was well known that he fenced every morning. You didn't need a fine mind to make the connection, which was fortunate, because Caspar certainly didn't have one. "Yes, how did you guess?" Giselle hadn't meant to kill the conversation quite so dead, but he passed it off with a false chuckle, and the smiles of the ladies soon returned. Laughed Caspar, ever willing to be the butt of a joke. "Giselle, may I introduce my cousin, the Lady Aristan Caspar? This is my superior officer, Captain Luther." So this was the famous cousin, one of the Union's richest heiresses, and from an excellent family. Caspar was always babbling about what a beauty she was, but to Giselle she seemed a pale, skinny, sickly-looking thing. She smiled weakly and offered out her limp white hand. He brushed it with the most perfunctory of kisses. "Charmed," he muttered without relish. "I must apologize for my appearance. I've just been fencing." "Yes," she squeaked in a high, piping voice once she was sure he had finished speaking. "I have heard you are a great fencer." There was a pause while she groped for something to say, then her eyes lit up. "Tell me, Captain, is fencing really very dangerous?" What insipid drivel. "Oh, no, my lady. We only use blunted steels in the circle." He could have said more, but he was damned if he was going to make all the effort. He gave a thin smile, so did she. The conversation hovered over the abyss. Giselle was about to make his excuses, the subject of fencing evidently exhausted, but Aris cut him off by blundering onto another topic. "And tell me, Captain, is there really likely to be a war in the north?" Her voice had almost entirely faded away by the end of the sentence, but the chaperone stared on approvingly, no doubt delighted by the conversational skills of her charge. Spares. "Well, it seems to me," Giselle began. The pale blue eyes of Lady Aris stared back at him expectantly. Blue eyes are absolute crap, he reflected. He wondered which subject she was more ignorant of, fencing or politics. "What do you think?" The chaperone's brow furrowed slightly. Lady Aris looked somewhat taken aback, blushing slightly as she groped for words. "Well, that is to say, I'm sure that everything will turn out well." Thank the fates, thought Giselle. We are saved. He had to get out of here. Of course, everything will turn out well. He forced out one more smile. It has been a real pleasure to make your acquaintance, but I'm afraid I'm on duty shortly, so I must leave you. He bowed with frosty formality. Lieutenant Casper, Lady Aris. Casper clapped him on the arm as friendly as ever. His ignorant waif of a cousin smiled uncertainly. The governess frowned at him as he passed, but Giselle took no notice. He arrived at the Lord's Round just as the council members were returning from their lunchtime recess. He acknowledged the guards in the vestibule with a terse nod, then strode through the enormous doorway and down the central aisle. A straggling column of the greatest peers of the realm were hard on his heels, and the echoing space was full of shuffling footsteps, grumblings and whisperings, as Giselle made his way around the curved wall to his place behind the high table. "Giselle, how was fencing?" It was Jallenhorm, here early for once, and seizing on the opportunity to talk before the Lord Chamberlain arrived. "I've had better mornings. Yourself?" "Oh, I've been having a fine time. I met that cousin of Casper's, you know." He searched for the name. Giselle sighed. "Lady Aris." "Yes, that's it. Have you seen her?" "I was lucky enough to run into them just now." "Phew!" exclaimed Jallenhorm, pursing his lips. "Isn't she stunning?" Giselle looked away, bored, and watched the robed and fur-trimmed worthies file slowly to their places. At least, he watched a sample of their least favourite sons and paid representatives. Very few of the magnates turned up in person for open council these days, not unless they had something significant to complain about. A lot of them didn't even bother to send someone in their place. "I swear, one of the finest-looking girls I ever saw. I know Casper's always raving about her, but he didn't do her justice." The councillors began to spread out, each man towards his own seat. The Lord's Round was designed like a theatre, the Union's leading noblemen sitting where the audience would be on a great half-circle of banked benches with an aisle down the centre. As in the theatre, some seats were better than others. The least important sat high up at the back, and the occupant's significance increased as you came forward. The front row was reserved for the heads of the very greatest families, or whoever they sent in their stead. Representatives from the south, from Degoska and Westport, were on the left, nearest to Giselle. On the far right were those from the north and west, from Angland and Starrickland. The bulk of the seating in between was for the old nobility of Midderland, the heart of the Union. The Union proper, as they would have seen it, as Giselle saw it too, for that matter. "What poise, what grace!" Jallenhorm was rhapsodizing. "That wonderful fair hair, that milky white skin, those fantastic blue eyes. And all of that money." "Well, yes, that too," smiled the big man. "Casper says his uncle is even richer than his father. Imagine that! And he is just the one child. She will inherit every mark of it, every mark." Jallenhorm could scarcely contain his excitement. "It's a lucky man that can bag her. What was her name again?" "Aris," said Giselle sourly. The lords, or their proxies, had all shuffled and grumbled their way to their seats. It was a poor attendance. The benches were less than half full. That was about as full as it ever got. If the Lord's Round really had been a theatre, its owners would have been desperately in search of a new play. "Aris, Aris." Jallenhorm smacked his lips as though the name left a sweet taste. "It's a lucky man that gets her." "Yes, indeed, a lucky man." Providing he prefers cash to conversation, that is. Giselle thought he might have preferred to marry the governess. At least she had seemed to have a bit of backbone. The Lord Chamberlain had entered the hall now, and was making his way towards the dais on which the high table stood, just about where the stage would have been, had the round been a theatre. He was followed by a gaggle of black-gowned secretaries and clerks, each man more or less encumbered with heavy books and sheaves of official-looking papers. With his crimson robes of state flapping behind him, Lord Hoff looked like nothing so much as a rare and stately gliding bird, pursued by a flock of troublesome crows. "Here comes old Vinegar," whispered Gyllenhaal as he sidled off to find his place on the other side of the table. Giselle put his hands behind his back and struck the usual pose, feet a little spread, chin high in the air. He swept an eye over the soldiers, regularly spaced around the curved wall, but each man was motionless and perfectly presented in full armor, as always. He took a deep breath and prepared himself for several hours of the most extreme tedium. The Lord Chamberlain threw himself into his tall chair and called for wine. The secretaries took their places around him, leaving a space in the centre for the king, who was absent as usual. Documents were rustled, great ledgers were heaved open, pens were sharpened and rattled in inkwells. The announcer walked to the end of the table and struck his staff of office on the floor for order. The whispering of the noblemen and their proxies, and that of the few attendees in the public gallery over their heads, gradually died down, leaving the vast chamber silent. The announcer puffed out his chest.
"I call this meeting,"
he said in slow and sonorous tones, as though he were giving the eulogy at a funeral,
"of the Open Council of the Union."
He gave an unnecessarily long and significant pause. The Lord Chamberlain's eyes flicked angrily towards him, but the announcer was not to be robbed of his moment of glory. He made everyone wait an instant longer before finishing.
"To order!"
"Thank you," said Hoff sourly. "I believe we were about to hear from the Lord Governor of Dagosca before we were interrupted by luncheon." The scratching nibs of quills accompanied his voice as two clerks recorded his every word. The faint echoes of the pens merged with the echoes of his words in the great space above. An elderly man struggled to his feet in the front row close to Giselle, some papers clasped before him in shaky hands.
"The Open Council,"
droned the announcer as ponderously as he dared,
"recognizes Rushdan Thule, accepted proxy of Sandan Worms, the Lord Governor of Dagosca."
"Thank you, sir." Thule's cracking, wispy voice was absurdly small in the vast space. It barely carried as far as Giselle, and he was no more than 10 strides away.
"My lords,"
he began.
"Speak up!"
called someone from the back. There was a ripple of laughter. The old man cleared his throat and tried again.
"My lords, I come before you with an urgent message from the Lord Governor of Dagosca."
His voice had already faded to its original, barely audible level, each word accompanied by the persistent scratching of quills. Whispers began to emanate from the public gallery above, making it still harder to hear him.
"The threat posed to that great city by the Emperor of Gurkul increases with every passing day."
Vague sounds of disapproval began to float up from the far side of the room, where the representatives from Angland were seated, but the bulk of the councillors simply looked bored.
"Attacks on shipping, harassment of traders, and demonstrations beyond our walls have compelled the Lord Governor to send me—"
"Luckios!"
someone shouted. There was another wave of laughter, slightly louder this time.
"The city is built on but a narrow peninsula,"
persisted the old man, straining to make himself heard over the increasing background noise.
"attached to a land controlled entirely by our bitter enemies, the Gurkish, and separated from Midland by wide leagues of salt water. Our defences are not all they might be. The Lord Governor is sorely in need of more funds."
The mention of funds brought instant uproar from the assembly. Thule's mouth was still moving, but there was no chance of hearing him now. The Lord Chamberlain frowned and took a swallow from his goblet. The clerk furthest from Jezal had laid down his quill and was rubbing his eyes with his inky thumb and forefinger. The clerk closest had just finished writing a line. Jezal craned forward to see. It said simply, "Some shouting here." The announcer thumped his staff on the tiles with a look of great self-satisfaction. The hubbub eventually died down, but Thule had now been taken with a coughing fit. He tried to speak, but was unable, and eventually he waved his hand and sat down, very red in the face, while his neighbour thumped him on the back. "If I may, Lord Chamberlain," shouted a fashionable young man in the front row on the other side of the hall, leaping to his feet. The scratching of the quills began once again. "It seems to me—" "The Open Council," cut in the announcer, "recognizes Herschel Dan Mead, third son and accepted proxy of Fedor Dan Mead, the Lord Governor of England." "It seems to me," continued the handsome young man, only slightly annoyed by this interruption, "that our friends in the south are forever expecting a full-scale attack by the Emperor." Dissenting voices were now raised on the other side of the room. "An attack which never materializes. Did we not defeat the Gurkish only a few short years ago, or does my memory deceive me?" The booing increased in volume. "This scaremongering represents an unacceptable drain on the Union's resources." He was shouting to be heard. "In England, we have many miles of border and too few soldiers, while the threat from Bethod and his Northmen is very real. If anyone is in need of funds—" The shouting was instantly redoubled. Cries of "Hear, hear!" "Nonsense!" "True!" and "Lies!" could be vaguely made out over the hubbub. Several of the representatives were on their feet shouting. Some vigorously nodded their agreement. Some violently shook their heads in dissent. Others yawned and stared around. Jezal could see one fellow, near to the back in the centre, who was almost certainly asleep, and in imminent danger of slumping into his neighbour's lap. He allowed his eyes to wander up over the faces ranged around the rail of the public gallery. He felt a strange tugging in his chest. R.D. West was up there, looking straight down at him. As their eyes met, she smiled and waved. He was smiling himself, with his arm halfway up to wave, when he remembered where he was. He pushed his arm behind his back and looked around nervously, but was relieved to find that no one important had noticed his mistake. The smile would not quite leave his face, though. "My lords!" roared the Lord Chamberlain, smashing his empty goblet down on the high table. He had the loudest voice Jezal had ever heard. Even Marshal Varuz could have learned a thing or two about shouting from off. The sleeping man near the back started up, sniffing and blinking. The noise died away almost immediately. Those representatives left standing looked around guiltily, like naughty children called to account, and gradually sat down. The whispers from the public gallery went still. Order was restored. "My lords, I can assure you the king has no more serious concern than the safety of his subjects, no matter where they are. The Union does not permit aggression against its people or property." Hoff punctuated each comment by smashing his fist down in front of him. "From the Emperor of Gurkel, from these savages in the north, or from anyone else." He struck the table so hard on this last comment that ink splashed from a well and ran all over one of the clerk's carefully prepared documents. Calls of agreement and support greeted the Lord Chamberlain's patriotic display. "As for the specific circumstance of Dagoska," Thule looked up hopefully, chest still shaking with suppressed coughs. "Is that city not possessed of some of the most powerful and extensive defences in the world? Did it not resist a siege by the Gurkish less than a decade ago for over a year? What has become of the walls, sir? The walls?" The great room fell quiet as everyone strained to hear the reply. "Lord Chamberlain," wheezed Thule, his voice nearly drowned out as one of the clerks turned the crackling page of his huge book and began scratching on the next.
The defences have fallen into poor repair, and we lack the soldiers to keep them properly manned. The Emperor is not ignorant of this.
He whispered, all but inaudible.
I beg of you.
He dissolved into another fit of coughing and dropped into his seat, accompanied by some light jeering from the Angland delegation. Hoff frowned even more deeply.
It was my understanding that the defences of the city were to be maintained by moneys raised locally and by trade levies upon the Honourable Guild of Spicers, who have operated in Dagoska under an exclusive and highly profitable license these past 7 years. If resources cannot be found even to maintain the walls, and he swept the assembly with a dark eye, perhaps it is time that this license was put out to tender.
There was a volley of angry mutterings around the public gallery.
In any case, the Crown can spare no extra moneys at present.
Jeers of dissatisfaction came from the Dagoska side of the room, hoots of agreement from the Angland side.
As for the specific circumstance of Angland,
thundered the Lord Chamberlain, turning towards Meade,
I believe we may shortly hear some good news for you to take back to your father, the Lord Governor.
A cloud of excited whisperings rose up into the gilded dome above. The handsome young man looked pleasantly surprised, as well he might. It was rare indeed that anyone took good news away from the open council, or news of any kind for that matter. Thule had got control of his lungs once more, and he opened his mouth to speak, but he was interrupted by a great beating on the huge door behind the high table. The lords looked up, surprised, expectant. The Lord Chamberlain smiled, in the manner of a magician who has just pulled off an exceptionally difficult trick. He signalled to the guards. The heavy iron bolts were drawn back, and the great inlaid doors creaked slowly open. 8 knights of the body, encased in glittering armour, faceless behind high polished helmets, resplendent in purple cloaks marked on the back with a golden sun, stomped in unison down the steps and took their places to either side of the high table. They were closely followed by 4 trumpeters, who stepped smartly forward, raising their shining instruments to their lips, and blew an ear-splitting fanfare. Giselle gritted his rattling teeth and narrowed his eyes, but eventually the ringing echoes faded. The Lord Chamberlain turned angrily toward the announcer, who was staring at the new arrivals with his mouth open.
Well?
Hissed Hoff. The announcer jumped to life.
Ah, yes, of course. My lords and ladies, I have the great honor to present...
He paused and took a huge breath.
His Imperial Highness, the King of Angland, of Starrickland, and of Midderland, the Protector of Westport and of Dagoska, His August Majesty Gustav V, High King of the Union.
There was a great rustling noise as every man and woman in the hall shifted from their seats and down onto one knee. The royal palanquin processed slowly through the doors, carried on the shoulders of 6 more faceless knights. The king was sitting in a gilded chair on top, propped up on rich cushions and swaying gently from side to side. He was staring about him with the startled expression of a man who went to sleep drunk and has woken up in an unfamiliar room. He looked awful, enormously fat, lolling like a great hill swathed in fur and red silk, head squashed into his shoulders by the weight of the great sparkling crown. His eyes were glassy and bulging, with huge dark bags hanging beneath, and the pink point of his tongue kept flicking nervously over his pale lips. He had great low jowls and a roll of fat around his neck. In fact, his whole face gave the appearance of having slightly melted and started to run down off his skull. Such was the High King of the Union, but Giselle bowed his head a little lower as the palanquin approached just the same.
"No,"
muttered his august majesty, as though he had forgotten something.
"please rise."
The rustling noise filled the hall again as everybody rose and returned to their seats. The king turned toward Hoff, brow deeply furrowed, and Jezal heard him say,
"Why am I here?"
The Northmen, your majesty.
"Oh, yes.
The king's eyes lit up. He paused.
What about them?"
But the Lord Chamberlain was saved from replying by the opening of the doors on the opposite side of the hall, the ones through which Jezal had first entered. Two strange men strode through and advanced down the aisle. One was a grizzled old warrior with a scar and a blind eye, carrying a flat wooden box. The other was cloaked and hooded, every feature hidden, and so big that he made the whole hall seem out of proportion. The benches, the tables, even the guards, all suddenly looked like small versions designed for the use of children. As he passed, a couple of the representatives closest to the aisle cringed and shuffled away. Jezal frowned to himself. This hooded giant did not have the look of good news, whatever Lord Hoff might say. Angry and suspicious mutterings filled the echoing dome as the two Northmen took their places on the tiled floor before the high table.
"Your Majesty,"
said the announcer, bowing so ridiculously low that he had to support himself with his staff.
"the Open Council recognizes Fenris the Feared, the envoy of Bethod, king of the Northmen, and his translator, White-Eye Hansel."
The king was staring off happily towards one of the great windows in the curved wall, utterly oblivious, perhaps admiring the way the light shone through the beautiful stained glass. But he looked suddenly round, jowls vibrating, as the old half-blind warrior addressed him.
"Your Majesty, I bring brotherly greetings from my master Bethod, king of the Northmen."
The round had fallen very still, and the clerk's scratching nibs seemed absurdly loud. The old warrior nodded at the great hooded shape beside him with an awkward smile.
"Fenris the Feared brings an offer from Bethod to yourself, from king to king, from the north to the Union. An offer and a gift."
And he raised the wooden box. The Lord Chamberlain gave a self-satisfied smirk.
Speak your offer first.
"It is an offer of peace, an endless peace between our two great nations." White-Eye bowed again. His manners were impeccable, Jezal had to admit, not what one would expect from savages of the cold and distant north. His goodly speech would almost have been enough to put the room at ease, had it not been for the hooded man beside him, looming like a dark shadow. The king's face twitched into a weak smile at this mention of peace, however.
"Good,"
he muttered.
"excellent, peace, capital, peace is good."
"He asks but one small thing in return," said White-Eye. The Lord Chamberlain's face had turned suddenly dour, but it was too late.
"He has but to name it,"
said the king, smiling indulgently. The hooded man stepped forward.
"Einland,"
he hissed. There was a moment of stillness. Then the hall exploded with noise. There was a gale of disbelieving laughter from the public gallery. Meade was on his feet, red-faced and screaming. Thule tottered up from his bench, then fell back coughing. Angry bellows were joined by hoots of derision. The king was staring about him with all the dignity of a startled rabbit. Jezal's eyes were fixed on the hooded man. He saw a great hand slip out from his sleeve and reach for the clasp on his cloak. He blinked in surprise. Was the hand blue, or was it just a trick of the light through the stained glass? The cloak dropped to the floor. Jezal swallowed, his heart thumping loud in his ears. It was like staring at a terrible wound. The more he was revolted, the less he could look away. The laughter died, the shouting died. The great space became terribly still once more. Fenris the Feared seemed larger yet without his cloak, towering over his cringing translator. Without any doubt, he was the biggest man that Jezal had ever seen, if man he was. His face was in constant, twisted, sneering motion. His bulging eyes twitched and blinked as they stared crazily around at the assembly. His thin lips smiled and grimaced and frowned by turns, never still. But all this seemed ordinary by comparison with his strangest feature. His whole left side, from head to toe, was covered in writing. Crabby runes were scrawled across the left half of his shaven head, across his eyelid, his lips, his scalp, his ear. His huge left arm was tattooed blue with tiny writing from bulging shoulder to the tips of his long fingers. Even his bare left foot was covered in strange letters. An enormous, inhuman, painted monster stood at the very heart of the Union's government. Jezal's jaw hung open. Around the high table there were 14 Knights of the Body, each man a hard-trained fighter of good blood. There were perhaps 40 guardsmen of Jezal's own company around the walls, each one a seasoned veteran. They outnumbered these 2 Northmen more than 20 to 1, and were well armed with the best steel the king's armories could provide. Fenris the Feared carried no weapon. For all his size and strangeness, he should have been no threat to them. But Jezal did not feel safe. He felt alone, weak, helpless, and terribly afraid. His skin was tingling, his mouth was dry. He felt a sudden urge to run and hide and never come out again. And this strange effect was not limited to him, or even to those around the high table. Angry laughs turned to shocked gurgles as the painted monster turned slowly around in the center of the circular floor, flickering eyes running over the crowd. Meade shrank back onto his bench, anger all leached out of him. A couple of worthies on the front row actually scrambled over the backs of their benches and into the row behind. Others looked away or covered their faces with their hands. One of the soldiers dropped his spear, and it clattered loudly to the floor. Fenris the Feared turned slowly to the high table, raising his great tattooed fist, opening his chasm of a mouth, a hideous spasm running over his face. "England!" he screamed, louder and more terrible by far than the Lord Chamberlain had ever been. The echoes of his voice bounced off the domed ceiling high above, resounded from the curved walls, filling the great space with piercing sound. One of the Knights of the Body stumbled back and slipped, his armored leg clanking against the edge of the high table. The king shrank back and covered his face with his hand, one terrified eye staring out from between his fingers, crown teetering on his head. The quill of one of the clerks dropped from his nerveless fingers. The hand of the other moved across the paper by habit, while his mouth fell open, scrawling a messy word diagonally through the neat lines of script above. England. The Lord Chamberlain's face had turned waxy pale. He reached slowly for his goblet, raised it to his lips. It was empty. He placed it carefully back down on the table, but his hand was trembling, and the base rattled on the wood. He paused for a moment, breathing heavily through his nose. "Plainly, this offer is not acceptable." "That is unfortunate," said White-Eye Hansel. "But there is still the gift." Every eye turned towards him. "In the north we have a tradition. On occasion, when there is bad blood between 2 clans, when there is the threat of war, champions come forward from each side to fight for all their people, so that the issue might be decided with only one death." He slowly opened the lid of the wooden box. There was a long knife inside, blade polished mirror bright. His greatness Bethod sends the Fjord, not only as his envoy, but as his champion. He will fight for Angland, if any here will face him, and spare you a war you will not win. He held the box up to the painted monster. This is my master's gift to you, and there could be none richer. Your lives. Fenris's right hand darted out and snatched the knife from the box. He raised it high, blade flashing in the colored light from the great windows. The knights should have jumped forward. Giselle should have drawn his sword. All should have rushed to the defense of the king, but nobody moved. Every mouth was agape, every eye fastened on that glinting tooth of steel. The blade flashed down. Its point drove easily through skin and flesh until it was buried right to the hilt. The point emerged, dripping blood from the underside of Fenris's own tattooed left arm. His face twitched, but no more than usual. The blade moved grotesquely as he stretched out his fingers, raised his left arm high for all to see. The drops of blood made a steady patter on the floor of the Lord's Round. "Who will fight me?" he screamed, great cords of sinew bulging from his neck. His voice was almost painful to the ear. Utter silence. The announcer, who was closest to the fjord and already on his knees, swooned and collapsed on his face. Fenris turned his goggling eyes on the biggest knight before the table, a full head shorter than he was. "You?" he hissed. The unfortunate man's foot scraped on the floor as he backed away, no doubt wishing he had been born a dwarf. A puddle of dark blood had spread across the floor beneath Fenris's elbow. "You!" he snarled at Fedor Dan Mead. The young man turned slightly grey, teeth rattling together, no doubt wishing he was someone else's son. Those blinking eyes swept across the ashen faces on the high table. Giselle's throat constricted as Fenris's eyes met his. "You?" "Well, I would, but I'm terribly busy this afternoon. Perhaps tomorrow?" The voice hardly sounded like his own. He certainly hadn't meant to say any such thing. But who else's could it be? The words floated confidently, breezily up towards the gilded dome above. There was scattered laughter, a shout of bravo from somewhere at the back, but the eyes of the fjord did not leave Giselle's for an instant. He waited for the sounds to die, then his mouth twisted into a hideous leer. "Tomorrow, then," he whispered. Giselle's guts gave a sudden, painful shift. The seriousness of the situation pressed itself upon him like a ton of rocks. Him? Fight that? "No!" It was the Lord Chamberlain. He was still pale, but his voice had regained much of its vigor. Giselle took heart and fought manfully for control of his bowels. "No!" barked Hoff again. "There will be no duel here. There is no issue to decide. Angland is a part of the Union by ancient law." White-Eye Hansel chuckled softly. "Ancient law? Angland is part of the North. 200 years ago there were Northmen there living free. You wanted iron, so you crossed the sea and slaughtered them and stole their land. It must be, then, that most ancient of laws, that the strong take what they wish from the weak." His eyes narrowed. "We have that law also." Fenris the Fjord ripped the knife from his arm. A few last drops of blood spattered onto the tiles, but that was all. There was no wound on the tattooed flesh, no mark at all. The knife clattered onto the tiles and lay there in the pool of blood at his feet. Fenris swept the assembly with his bulging, blinking, crazy eyes one last time. Then he turned and strode across the floor and up the aisle, lords and proxies scrambling away down their benches as he approached. White-Eye Hansel bowed low. "Perhaps the time will come when you wish that you had accepted our offer or our gift. You will hear from us," he said quietly. Then he held up 3 fingers to the Lord Chamberlain. "When it is time, we will send 3 signs."
"Send 300 if you wish," barked Hoff. "But this pantomime is over."
White-Eye Hansel nodded pleasantly. "You will hear from us." And he turned and followed Fenris the Feared out of the Lord's Round. The great doors clapped shut. The quill of the nearest clerk scratched weakly against the paper. "You will hear from us." Herschel Dan Mead turned towards the Lord Chamberlain, jaw locked tight, handsome features contorted with fury.
"And this is the good news you would have me convey to my father?"
he screamed. The open council erupted. Bellowing, shouting, abuse directed toward anyone and everyone, chaos of the worst kind. Hoff jumped up, chair toppling over behind him, mouthing angry words, but even he was drowned out by the uproar. Mead turned his back on him and stormed out. Other delegates from the Angland side of the room rose grimly and followed the son of their Lord Governor. Hoff stared after them, livid with anger, mouth working silently. Giselle watched the king slowly take his hand from his face and lean down towards his Lord Chamberlain.
"When are the Northmen getting here?"
he whispered.